Hi, my name is Philippe Giabbanelli, and I'm presenting this short overview of my work on participatory modeling and mixed methods. I've been invited by Brian Castellani at Durham University, where this presentation is recorded, and I'd like to thank Brian for inviting me here. In this brief presentation, we will look at some of the tools that I happen to use in my own work. So we'll be looking at my own toolbox, but I want to make it clear that there are many tools used in participatory modeling. It depends on the data you have. It depends on what is the problem, what the participants wish to get out of the exercise. So there are many considerations. I will only comment on the tools that I happen to use for this brief presentation, but there are many alternatives. So here we're going to start by looking at facilitation using cognitive or concept mapping. I often use fuzzy cognitive mapping, but that is not contained in this presentation. And I also use agent-based modeling, which is contained here. So we're going to start with facilitation. If you want to look at other tools, there is a paper that gives you an overview, what is available, what to choose. So I would refer you to that paper for the broader toolbox here. So when I do facilitation, there are various options that I could be using. So I could, for example, have a whole group with me, but I do not tend to use that option very much because I believe that some of the power dynamics within a group can be tricky to handle. And I really prefer to give each person the whole room to express himself or herself. So I do a lot of one-on-one interviews, usually takes about 1 hour. The process that I go through is the following. So I start with the problem of interest. In this brief presentation, we'll be using suicide as the guiding example. So for instance, I would ask one of the subject matter experts or participant, what do you think creates the problem? So what do you think are some of the causes of suicide ideation? It's very important to have a balance when you create a map, because if all you have is what creates the problem, then there is no solution whatsoever in the map. And that will later on mean that if you create a computational model, like an agent-based model, all of your agents will have an extreme behavior because there is no balance in it. So if all you have is the causes of suicide, then all of your agents will engage in suicide ideation because there is nothing that prevents them from doing it. So it is very important in my practice that I balance the causes of the problem with what prevents it, because not everybody has suicidal thoughts. Not everybody has a given problem. So we need to understand what makes people express that problem and what prevents it. Balance is key. The consequences of the problem are important too, while noting that many of them will feed back. So that picture is a very simple diagram at the moment, but feedback loops, cycles, will exist. Many of the consequences of a problem will actually reinforce that problem itself. So we will have to make sure when we create such maps that we have the feedback loops that create the complexity of a problem. Once that first series of steps is done, what you have essentially is the first layer. So I think of a map as an onion. I start at the center with the problem of interest, and then I work my way out gradually until I get to something that is more tangential or not essential for the problem. So for instance, we may hear from one of the subject matter experts that a difficult family situation contributes to suicidal thoughts, but it is not relevant for a suicide model to understand why, for example, people would engage in a divorce, why people have some specific financial insecurity. It would be too detailed sometimes. So it's key to keep the map relevant to the problem at hand. Some of the ways in which we strengthen the map, in which we bring the right level of details, would be that we ensure that everything that people believe is connected is represented. We need to make sure that if people see intermediates, we account for them. So particularly when somebody says A is related to B, but sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, it's likely that there are actually two different paths. So there's a path that would increase from A to B and a path that would decrease from A to B. So in that case, it's important to detail the mechanisms. When is there an increase? When is there a decrease? If it's too high, if it's an exceedingly high level view, we need to have more details. And like I've said, you keep doing that, you keep building your onion until you have the right sufficiently comprehensive map, until the expert basically feels that he or she is done. There are many papers in which I've done that, but I'm far from the only person who does that. there are, I would say, hundreds of studies that build maps with participants. It's a very common approach. I'm mentioning this study because it follows the exact process that I've shown you here. Once you have built a map with an expert, your options include showing them the map directly, or showing them parts of the map or various other artifacts. I don't usually show people the map that I've created because these maps can be quite large and not everybody is comfortable in analyzing a large network. So what I could show them, for example, would be some of the excerpts, some of the parts of the map, but the entire map can be tricky, particularly if it's large. Not everybody has the tools, the means, or the interest to engage in large graph visualizations. So the way I build my maps usually wouldn't be that I build them on the fly because I want to be able to focus on what the person is saying. So rather, I make some brief notes for myself to make sure that I don't lose the thread, but later I will replay the recordings of the conversation, transcribe them, and as you can see, I will turn that into maps. It is important to note that this process is very time consuming. If it takes 1 hour to have an interview and then maybe 2 hours to transcribe it, we're looking at least 3 hours per person. If you have 15 informants, that's already quite a lot of hours. So I like to automatize as much as I can. So for example, recently, I've had the pleasure of co-supervising a PhD student, Chris Davis, who graduated now, and whose paper was very nice in automatically turning text into not only maps, but also potential intervention scenarios. So there is an interest in automatizing that work so that we can actually involve more people. Because if it takes 3 hours per person, you're not going to involve hundreds of people. Even 15 is already quite a lot. So if you want to have scale, if you want to have very representative groups into a process, you need to find ways to scale it up. Hence, you need to find algorithms to scale it up. We also have solutions that try to replace the facilitator entirely by an algorithm. So there is a video you can watch for the details here. Essentially, we repurposed Alexa, we programmed it such that you would be able to carry on a conversation, to extract key terms, to build a network. And at the end of the conversation, Alexa actually even emails the network to the participant. It's not perfect. Anything you automatize is suffering from some inaccuracy, but you do it in exchange for scale. I cannot sit down with anybody anytime. Facilitators are limited. There are not so many facilitators around. So if you have a simple device that can get at least a basic map going, that could be an asset, again, to scale up and to increase the involvement of citizens in science here. That is detailed in a paper as well, but the video would give you a sufficient idea of how it works. Again, there are limitations as soon as you use technology. Once I speak to individuals, I need at some point to move to a group level map. So what you can see here are parts of 3 individual maps. So the top left is what one person said, top right is what a different person said. The colors show you that some of the terms actually would be equivalent, even though the wordings are different. So for example, feeling like a burden would be the same as perceived burdensomeness. Family history of suicide would be the same as suicide attempts in family within the context of this problem. So the issue is that people choose different words and they have the right to. I do not wish to constrain them. I wish to have rich information, but then I need to have one map for the entire group. So in that case, what we need to do is to figure out how different terms are equivalent. This has been a very labor-intensive process again. So for example, many years ago, that's what my desk looked like. It was taking quite some time. So what I've done with one of my students is to find algorithms, to develop them, to test them, to assess them, that can automatically identify when factors expressed differently across individuals actually would mean the same thing. For that, we use the semantic similarity. So we look at how close are the words. They don't have to be the same. There are ways to account for synonyms, for example. And we also look at where they are in the network. So for example, if there are 2 terms that have the same consequences, some shared antecedents, then it is likely that they would be equivalent. So we take into account similarity in the word use and similarity in the network position. And that's how we can quite accurately actually tell if people mean the same thing. And that simplifies the process of combining the maps. I wish to insist on the fact that transparency doesn't stop through the modeling process. It really goes on and on. So at first, I wish to have a transparent process to elicit maps, viewpoints, and perspectives from participants. However, if I'm not careful, that transparency that I have at first is going to be lost at some point. Because once you put all the individual maps into one overall map of the problem, it's a very large map. And sometimes it has complex structures. So for example, individuals may not have loops. They may have somewhat simpler structures, but the group starts to exhibit loops, different paths. It's a much richer, but much more complex structure. And because of that, it can be difficult for individuals to look at what the group has said. So what I try to do is to avoid having a situation that is transparent for people to give me information, but then opaque when I'm trying to give back to people. It has to be fair both ways. If I take, I gotta give. So what we've done here is we used machine learning with one of my students, Anish, and we are using machine learning for natural language generation. So we are automatically transforming a large model into text. So for example, we feed in the model piece by piece. So we decompose the model automatically, and we generate text as a consequence. We don't generate text by using a template. That would be outdated and it'd be boring to read. You don't want to read A increases B, B increases C. That is not what you want to read. It doesn't have to be great literature, but it should be readable. So what we do is we use deep neural networks that have been trained on a lot of text and have the ability to be somewhat creative while remaining accurate. So here are two examples of what our approach actually outputs. So these are not illustrative examples. These are actually from the paper here, where we applied the deep neural networks to explain models regarding obesity and also models regarding suicide. There are, again, inaccuracies. As soon as you automate something, there will be some problems of inaccuracies, but it scales. It's something that otherwise would take a human hours to do by hand. And to conclude, I wish to briefly point out that models for participatory modeling are not done when you feel that you have gotten all the information and sent the report back to people. If participants are to be truly engaged in the process, then I would posit that models are a product that should be usable by participants. They should be able to integrate that in their practices. They should be able to use that independently to ask questions. So we have to actually really care about how a model is a product. What is the usability of the model? So for this goal, for example, we create platforms so that it should be relatively simple, we hope, but we test that, we assess the usability of creating a model. So in this example for suicide, people can walk through a few steps to create a model, how many agents they want in their agent-based model, what policies they wish to implement, and then they can see the results of the model against expectation. So people typically ask, how accurate is the model? How much can I trust it? To answer that question, we like to compare the output of the models against expectations. We can also compare different interventions. We have means to automatically create a report for people. So all that was explained in detail in a recent paper. Note that when you create a model as a product, you have to think of a few more constraints. So you really have to think of what do the users normally do? What do the users need? And when you start having that viewpoint, you move into a long-term perspectives. For example, you have to think of how to maintain a model. What if new policy questions will arise in the future? Is the model going to be toast, entirely redone, or is there a way for people to keep using it for at least a few years? So when we create models as products, we think of how we can let people use that for as long as can be, how we can let them make the changes that they might need to continuously adapt. So for example, data may change, but there are various constraints there. So it's not as easy as just updating a new data file, because there might be problems that prevent people from having direct access to the data. Participants are usually not coders or modelers themselves, so they do not want to have to change the code. Participants may work as groups, so you're not just looking at one individual who does everything, you're looking at how a group together as a set of individuals can update the data. So we create various means for people to manage the data that is in the model without having to directly change the code. So for example, we have various regressions that are automatically tested to make sure they can be used by the model, that they are valid. We allow people to have different roles so that, for example, some of them are the official data managers of the team and roles can be changed. We also have to think of the software ecosystem. So for me, modeling and simulation is also a matter of software engineering. So if I create a model, how will people be able to use it? Maybe they will use NetLogo and that's simple, but this is not usually the type of people I work with. I work with people who are not modelers. So I have to think of where will they deploy the model? And if you think of that part, you have to be aware that you do not control the software ecosystem of all of your users. So you do not necessarily know what platform they are going to be running. You don't know what libraries or versions they will have because they can update everything. So we have to make sure that we can deploy for something that is not under our control. So what we do is we have deployment processes. So for example, we use Dockers, we use containers to really create a model that is a deployable product, just as you would download Word and Excel and be able to install it on your computer. So we have to have a fully self-contained model so that anybody can use it out there. So these are my final thoughts. And once again, I would like to thank Brian for inviting me to share some of the thoughts and some of the work I've done on participatory modeling.